In 1954, the United States Supreme Court issued one of its most significant rulings in history, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. This landmark decision fundamentally changed the landscape of American society by declaring that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The case not only marked a turning point in the civil rights movement, but also laid the groundwork for the desegregation of public institutions across the country. But what exactly was Brown v. Board of Education, and why did it have such a profound impact on American life? To understand the significance of Brown v. Board of Education, it's essential to look at the legal and social context leading up to the case. In the late 19th century, the Supreme Court had upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation in its infamous 1896 decision, Plessy v. Ferguson. The court ruled that separate but equal facilities for different races were permissible under the Constitution, effectively sanctioning the segregationist practices that became prevalent throughout the United States, particularly in the South. This decision provided legal cover for a wide range of discriminatory practices, including segregated schools, transportation, and public accommodations. By the mid-20th century, the separate but equal doctrine had been deeply entrenched in American society, especially in education. In many parts of the country, black and white children were forced to attend separate schools, which were far from equal. Schools for black children were often underfunded, lacked adequate resources, and were housed in inferior facilities. The inequality in education was stark and undeniable, and it was clear that the promise of equal was a hollow one. Against this backdrop, a series of lawsuits challenging school segregation began to emerge, culminating in Brown v. Board of Education. The case was actually a consolidation of 5 separate cases from Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., all of which had been brought by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The plaintiffs in these cases argued that segregated schools were inherently unequal and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The lead case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, involved a young black girl named Linda Brown, who was denied entry to an all-white elementary school in her hometown of Topeka, Kansas. Her father, Oliver Brown, sued the Topeka Board of Education, arguing that the segregation of schools by race was unconstitutional. The case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, where it was heard in December 1952 and again in December 1953. The legal team representing the plaintiffs was led by Thurgood Marshall, a brilliant lawyer who would later become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Marshall and his team argued that segregated schools were inherently unequal and that segregation itself inflicted psychological harm on black children, fostering a sense of inferiority that would have long-lasting negative effects. To support their case, they presented evidence from psychological studies, including the famous doll test conducted by psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark. The Clarks' research showed that black children, when given the choice between black and white dolls, often chose the white dolls, associating them with positive qualities, while viewing the black dolls as inferior. This was used to demonstrate the damaging impact of segregation on the self-esteem of black children. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court delivered its unanimous decision, declaring that racial segregation in public schools was inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. In the court's opinion, written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, it was stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The ruling effectively overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, rejecting the separate but equal doctrine and setting a new legal precedent for the treatment of race in American law. The decision in Brown v. Board of Education was met with a mixed response. While it was celebrated as a monumental victory for civil rights, it also faced significant resistance, particularly in the South. Some states implemented a strategy of massive resistance, with politicians and school boards employing various tactics to delay or avoid desegregation. In some cases, schools were shut down entirely rather than integrated. The ruling also led to a wave of protests and clashes between civil rights activists and segregationists, highlighting the deep racial tensions in the country. Despite the resistance, Brown v. Board of Education had a profound impact on the civil rights movement. It provided a legal and moral foundation for subsequent efforts to dismantle segregation and discrimination in other areas of American life. The decision inspired a generation of activists and helped to galvanize the movement, leading to further landmark legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, the promise of Brown versus Board of Education was not fully realized immediately. In the years following the decision, progress toward desegregation was slow and uneven. In 1955, the Supreme Court issued a follow-up ruling known as Brown 2, which ordered that desegregation occur with all deliberate speed. This vague wording allowed many school districts to drag their feet, and it would take years of continued activism, litigation, and federal intervention to make significant strides toward desegregation. Even today, more than 6 decades after the Brown decision, the legacy of segregation continues to affect American education. Many schools, particularly in urban areas, remain racially and economically segregated, a result of factors such as residential patterns, economic inequality, and disparities in school funding. The fight for truly equal education continues, and the principles established in Brown versus Board of Education remain as relevant as ever. In conclusion, Brown versus Board of Education was a watershed moment in American history. It marked the beginning of the end for legally sanctioned racial segregation and set the stage for the civil rights movement's subsequent victories. The case demonstrated the power of the judicial system to challenge and change unjust laws and practices, and it remains a powerful symbol of the ongoing struggle for racial equality in the United States. As we reflect on Brown's legacy, it's important to recognize both the progress that has been made and the work that still lies ahead in the pursuit of true equality for all.